I was standing in what used to be my $10 million mountain mansion in Aspen, Colorado. Except now, it was just a pile of rubble and twisted steel beams, and the middle-aged woman in front of me with her arms crossed, and a satisfied smile on her face had absolutely no idea who I was. "Well, Mr. Whitmore, perhaps next time you'll think twice before ignoring your homeowner association obligations," Patricia Kendall said, her blonde bob cut swaying as she shook her head with mock sympathy. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, and her perfectly manicured nails tapped against the clipboard she held like it was some kind of holy document. I took a deep breath, trying to control the rage that was building inside me. The demolition crew was still packing up their equipment behind her, their trucks rumbling as they prepared to leave the scene of what I could only describe as complete and utter destruction. My home, the place where I'd planned to spend my weekends away from the state capital in Denver, was gone. 24 hours ago, it had been standing. Now it looked like a war zone. "Patricia, let me make sure I understand this correctly," I said, keeping my voice calm despite every instinct telling me to lose it completely. "You demolished my house because I owed the HOA $15,000 in fines." She consulted her clipboard with exaggerated precision. $15,347 to be exact, plus interest and administrative fees. "We sent you multiple notices, Mr. Whitmore. The rules clearly state that after 6 months of non-payment and failure to respond to communications, the association has the right to take corrective action, including demolition of structures that violate our community standards." Violate your community standards. My house was a custom-designed architectural masterpiece. Patricia's expression hardened. "Your house had the wrong shade of brown on the shutters. We require autumn harvest brown, and you had mountain earth brown. We also documented that your outdoor lighting exceeded the approved lumens by 30%. Your mailbox was 2 inches too tall, and you planted aspens instead of the approved blue spruce trees in your front landscape." I stared at her, genuinely speechless for a moment. I'd been so focused on running the state of Colorado for the past 18 months since my inauguration that I hadn't paid much attention to the mail coming to my Aspen property. My assistant handled most of it, or at least I thought she did. Apparently, these HOA notices had slipped through the cracks, and now I was paying the price in the most dramatic way possible. "You know what, Patricia? I'm going to give you one chance to fix this situation before things get very complicated for you and your HOA board," I said. She actually laughed. It was a sharp, condescending sound that made my jaw clench. "Fix it? Mr. Whitmore, the demolition is complete. What's done is done. If you'd like to rebuild, you'll need to submit architectural plans to the board for approval, pay all outstanding fines and fees, and of course, adhere to our community guidelines this time. You know who I am. You're Derek Whitmore, property owner at 2847 Alpine Ridge Drive, or at least you were. Now you're just a man standing on an empty lot with a very expensive mess to clean up." I pulled out my phone and made a call. She watched me with that insufferable smile still on her face, clearly thinking I was calling a lawyer or maybe my insurance company. The phone rang twice before my chief of staff, Marcus Chen, picked up. "Governor, I wasn't expecting to hear from you this weekend. Is everything all right?" "Marcus, I need you to connect me with the state attorney general, the county sheriff's office, and our legal team. Also, pull every permit issued for demolition in Pitkin County over the past month. I'm specifically looking for a demolition at 2847 Alpine Ridge Drive in Aspen." There was a pause on the other end. "Sir, that's your property. What happened?" The HOA demolished my house, Marcus, my entire house, while I was in Denver at the budget meetings yesterday. Patricia's smile faltered slightly. I saw her shift her weight, the tiniest crack in her confidence. The HOA demolished the governor's mansion. Are you serious right now? Marcus sounded incredulous. Completely serious. I'm standing in the rubble as we speak. Get me those permits and find out what legal authority they claim to have for this. On it right now, sir. I'll have the information within the hour. I hung up and looked back at Patricia, who had gone noticeably pale. Governor, she said weakly. Governor Derek Whitmore, actually. I've been running this state for the past 18 months. You might have seen me on the news occasionally, signing bills into law, dealing with the drought crisis, managing the state budget. You know, small stuff. She opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. We had no idea. Your name on the property records just said Derek Whitmore. There was no indication that you were. I mean, we followed procedure. Everything was by the book. By the book. You demolished a $10 million home over some paint colors and tree varieties. Walk me through this procedure, Patricia, because I'm extremely interested in understanding how an HOA in Colorado believes it has the legal authority to destroy private property. She was frantically flipping through papers on her clipboard now, her hands shaking slightly. The covenants, conditions, and restrictions, or CC and Rs, for Elk Mountain Estates clearly state that persistent violations and failure to pay assessed fines can result in remedial action. Section 17, subsection 4, paragraph 9 states that the board may take necessary steps to bring a property into compliance. And you interpreted that as permission to demolish an entire house. Our legal counsel approved it. Henderson and Associates, they're a reputable firm in Denver. They reviewed everything. I know Henderson and Associates. I'm going to be very interested in what they have to say about this. I looked around at the destruction, my anger building again. Patricia, who else is on your HOA board? There's myself as president. Then we have Robert Cunningham as vice president, Sandra Morrison as treasurer, and James Fletcher as secretary. And all of you approved this demolition, she nodded miserably. It was a unanimous vote. But Mr. Whitmore, Governor Whitmore, we truly believed we were within our rights. You have to understand, we run a very exclusive community here. Our property values are among the highest in Colorado because we maintain strict standards. We can't have residents just ignoring the rules, even if they're wealthy or important. Let me explain something to you about property rights in Colorado, Patricia. While HOAs do have certain powers granted to them through their CC and Artiques and state law, they absolutely do not have the right to demolish occupied, structurally sound homes without a court order. What you've done here isn't just a civil matter. This is criminal destruction of property. Her face went from pale to completely white. Criminal, but our lawyer said. Then your lawyer gave you catastrophically bad advice and you're all going to pay the price for it. My phone rang and I saw it was Marcus calling back. Yes, Governor, I've got some information. The demolition permit was issued by the county, but it was requested under the pretense of a dangerous structure removal. The HOA apparently claimed the building was unsafe and needed immediate demolition. The building was structurally sound. I had it inspected 6 months ago when I bought it. That's what I figured. Sir, this looks like fraud. They misrepresented the situation to obtain the permit. I've got the Attorney General's office on standby, and Sheriff Martinez from Pitkin County is heading to your location now with a deputy. Good. Thank you, Marcus. Also, reach out to my insurance company and start documenting everything. I want photographs, statements from the demolition crew, copies of all permits and communications. I ended the call and turned back to Patricia, who looked like she might be sick. The sheriff is on his way. I'd suggest you call the other board members and your attorney, because you're all going to need representation. Please, Governor Whitmore, surely we can work something out. This was an honest mistake. We had no idea who you were, and we were just trying to enforce our community standards. We can refund your fines. We can help pay for rebuilding, whatever you need. This stopped being about what I need the moment you turned my property into a pile of rubble. This is about the rule of law. If an HOA can do this to the governor of Colorado, imagine what they can do to regular citizens who don't have the resources to fight back. How many other people in this community have you terrorized with your petty rules and threats? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. I'd heard stories about HOA overreach before, had even considered legislation to rein in their powers, but I'd always had more pressing matters to deal with. Now it was personal, and I was going to make sure this particular HOA faced the full consequences of their actions. A Pitkin County Sheriff's SUV pulled up 20 minutes later, lights flashing. Sheriff Roberto Martinez stepped out, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression. I'd met him a few times at law enforcement conferences. He recognized me immediately. Governor Whitmore, I got the call from your office. What the hell happened here? I gestured at the rubble. The Elk Mountain Estates HOA decided to demolish my house over unpaid fines related to paint colors and landscaping choices. I'm told they obtained the demolition permit by claiming the structure was dangerous, which was a lie. Sheriff Martinez looked at Patricia, who was now sitting on the hood of her Mercedes, looking utterly defeated. Madam, I'm going to need to see all documentation related to this demolition. Permits, board meeting minutes, communications with the property owner, everything. It's all here, she said weakly, holding out her clipboard. But Sheriff, we were told this was legal. Our attorney approved everything. Unless you had a court order, madam, you can't just demolish someone's home. HOA rules don't supersede property law. He took the clipboard and started reviewing the documents, his frown deepening as he read. Governor, this is going to take some time to sort out, but from what I'm seeing here, there's enough evidence for criminal charges. Fraud for the permit application, destruction of property, possibly conspiracy depending on how involved their attorney was. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. He'd managed to contact the demolition company, and they'd confirmed that the HOA had told them the property was abandoned and condemned. More lies, more fraud. The company had photos and paperwork that contradicted everything Patricia had claimed. Sheriff, I want to press full charges. Not just against Patricia here, but against every member of the board who voted for this demolition. Understood, sir. I'll need statements from you, documentation of ownership, proof of the property's condition before demolition, and anything else that can establish this was done improperly. My chief of staff is gathering all of that as we speak. The demolition company has also confirmed that the HOA misrepresented the situation to them. They were told the building was abandoned and condemned by the county. Sheriff Martinez shook his head in disbelief. This is one of the most blatant cases of HOA overreach I've ever seen, and I've seen some bad ones. Madam, I'm going to need you to come down to the station and make a formal statement. I'd also advise you to contact the other board members immediately and inform them they'll need to do the same. Patricia was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks. My husband is going to kill me. Do you know how much this is going to cost us, our reputation in this community? Your reputation. I couldn't help but raise my voice. Patricia, you demolished my house. You fraudulently obtained permits, you lied to a demolition company, and you destroyed $10 million worth of property over some paint colors. Your reputation is the least of your concerns right now." She flinched at my tone, and I felt a small twinge of guilt. Not much, but a twinge. I reminded myself that she was about to face serious consequences, both criminal and civil, and that her life was about to get very complicated. But then, I looked at the pile of rubble that used to be my home, and the sympathy evaporated. Over the next few hours, the scene became increasingly chaotic. The other HOA board members arrived one by one, summoned by frantic calls from Patricia. Robert Cunningham, the vice president, was a heavy-set man in his 60s who went red in the face when he realized who I was. Sandra Morrison, the treasurer, was a thin woman with gray hair who immediately started blaming Patricia for the whole thing. James Fletcher, the secretary, was the youngest of the group at maybe 45, and he looked like he wanted to sink into the ground and disappear. Sheriff Martinez interviewed each of them separately while his deputy took photographs and collected evidence. I stood to the side, watching the investigation unfold, making phone calls to coordinate with my staff in Denver. This was going to be a media nightmare, and we needed to get ahead of the story before it spiraled out of control. "Governor, we need to discuss how to handle the press on this," Marcus said when I called him with an update. "This is going to be everywhere by tomorrow morning." HOA demolishes governor's mansion is too good a headline for anyone to pass up. Let them run with it. I want full transparency on this. The people of Colorado should know what happened here, and they should understand the dangers of unchecked HOA power. We're going to use this as a catalyst for reform. You want to push HOA reform legislation? Absolutely. I was already concerned about some of the stories I'd been hearing. HOAs foreclosing on elderly residents over trivial violations, banning children from playing outside, fining people hundreds of dollars for having the wrong color flowers. This is an epidemic, Marcus, and what happened to me is just the most dramatic example. If they can do this to a governor, they can do it to anyone. I'll start working on a legislative package. We can introduce it in the next session. Good. And Marcus, make sure our communications team emphasizes that I'm not looking for special treatment because I'm the governor. I want the same justice any property owner in Colorado would deserve. Understood, sir. By evening, all 4 HOA board members had been taken to the Pitkin County Sheriff's Office for formal questioning. Sheriff Martinez told me they'd likely face charges of criminal mischief, fraud, and conspiracy. The demolition company was cooperating fully with the investigation, and their documentation made it clear that the HOA had deliberately misled them about the property's status. I checked into a hotel in downtown Aspen, a nice place with mountain views that would have been relaxing under different circumstances. Instead, I spent the evening on conference calls with my legal team, my insurance company, and various state officials who needed to be briefed on the situation. My press secretary, Jennifer Kowalski, had prepared a statement for release the next morning. "Governor, every major news outlet is going to want an interview," she warned me. "This is huge, not just in Colorado but nationally. HOA horror stories always get traction, but this is next level. Set up a press conference for tomorrow afternoon. I'll make a statement and take questions. I want to be clear about what happened and what we're going to do about it." "Are you sure you want to do this so quickly? We could wait a few days, let things settle." "No. The story is going to break tonight anyway. Better to control the narrative from the start." She was right about the media interest. By 10 p.m., my phone was buzzing constantly with requests from journalists. Twitter was exploding with the news. Someone had leaked the story, probably one of the deputies, or maybe even one of the HOA board members trying to get their side out first. The headlines were exactly what Marcus had predicted. Colorado Governor's Aspen Mansion demolished by HOA over petty violations. HOA destroys Governor Whitmore's $10 million home when HOAs go too far. Governor's property reduced to rubble. I read through some of the articles and social media posts before bed. The response was overwhelmingly supportive. People were outraged on my behalf, sharing their own HOA horror stories, calling for reform. A few commenters questioned whether I was making a big deal out of nothing, suggesting that I should have just paid the fines, but they were quickly shouted down by the majority. One comment stuck with me. A woman named Teresa from Colorado Springs wrote, "My HOA foreclosed on my mother's house because she had a small vegetable garden they said violated the landscaping rules. She was 83 years old and lost her home of 40 years over tomato plants. I'm glad this happened to the governor because maybe now someone will finally do something about these dictators who hide behind community standards." That was exactly the point. This wasn't just about my demolished mansion. It was about every person who'd been victimized by an HOA that had overstepped its authority. I was in a position to actually do something about it, and I intended to follow through. The next morning, I met with Sheriff Martinez at his office to review the evidence they'd collected. The case against the HOA board was solid. They'd lied on the permit application, claiming the structure was dangerous when county records showed no such designation. They'd misrepresented the situation to the demolition company. And most damningly, their own board meeting minutes showed that Patricia had questioned whether they had the legal authority to proceed with the demolition. But the attorney they'd consulted had assured them it was permissible under their CC and Articus. "I've got to call in to this attorney, Gerald Henderson," Sheriff Martinez said. "He's going to have some explaining to do. If he knowingly gave them bad legal advice that led to this, he could be facing charges too, not to mention disbarment." "What about the demolition company? Are they facing any liability?" "Doubtful. They relied on the permits and the representations made to them. They're victims of the fraud as much as you are. They've already said they're willing to testify against the HOA board." "Good. What's the timeline looking like for charges?" "District Attorney is reviewing everything today. I expect formal charges to be filed by the end of the week. We're looking at felony criminal mischief given the value of the property, multiple counts of fraud, and conspiracy charges for each board member who participated in the decision." "And what about restitution?" "That'll be part of the criminal case, but you'll probably want to pursue a civil suit as well. $10 million in property damage, plus your personal belongings that were destroyed, plus costs to rebuild. You're looking at a significant judgment." I nodded. The money wasn't really the issue. I was wealthy enough that I could rebuild without financial strain. But I wanted the HOA and its board members to face real consequences, both as punishment and as a deterrent to other HOAs who might think they could get away with similar behavior. The press conference was scheduled for 2 p.m. at the state capitol in Denver. I drove back from Aspen that morning, giving me time to review my statement and prepare for what I knew would be aggressive questioning from reporters. Jennifer had warned me that this was going to be a circus. She wasn't wrong. The press room was packed with journalists from local and national outlets. I saw crews from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and all the major networks. The room buzzed with anticipation as I walked to the podium, flanked by Marcus and Jennifer. "Good afternoon. I'm going to make a brief statement, and then I'll take your questions." I looked out at the sea of faces, cameras pointed at me, reporters with notepads ready. Yesterday morning, I received a call informing me that my property in Aspen, Colorado, had been demolished by the Elk Mountain Estates Homeowner Association. I initially thought there must be some mistake. But when I arrived at the scene, I found that my home, a $10 million custom mountain residence, had indeed been reduced to rubble. I paused, letting that sink in. The HOA claimed they had the authority to do this because I owed approximately $15,000 in fines for violations, including the wrong shade of brown paint on my shutters, outdoor lighting that was too bright, and planting aspen trees instead of blue spruce. They obtained a demolition permit from Pitkin County by fraudulently claiming the structure was dangerous and needed immediate removal. This was a lie. The building was structurally sound and had been professionally inspected. The room was dead silent except for the clicking of cameras. I want to be clear about something. This is not about me being the governor. This is about a fundamental abuse of power by an organization that is supposed to serve its community, not terrorize it. If an HOA can do this to the governor of Colorado, they can do it to anyone. And based on the hundreds of messages I've received in the past 24 hours, they are doing it to people across this state and across this country. I took a breath. I am announcing today that I will be working with the state legislature to introduce comprehensive HOA reform legislation in the next session. This legislation will include strict limits on an HOA's ability to fine residents, clear procedures for appeals and dispute resolution, prohibitions on foreclosure or property destruction without a court order, and criminal penalties for HOA board members who abuse their authority. What happened to my property was criminal, and the individuals responsible will face criminal charges, but we need to make sure it never happens to anyone else. The questions came rapid fire after that. Governor, do you accept any responsibility for not paying the fines? Are you using your position to get revenge on the HOA? What about property rights? Don't HOAs have the right to enforce their rules? How much is this going to cost the taxpayers? I answered each question calmly and methodically. Yes, I should have been more attentive to the notices, but that didn't give the HOA the right to demolish my property. No, I wasn't seeking revenge, I was seeking justice. Yes, HOAs have rights, but those rights don't include criminal fraud and destruction of property. And no, this wouldn't cost taxpayers anything. I was pursuing this through normal legal channels and paying for my own legal representation. One reporter asked a question that I'd been expecting. Governor, some people are saying you're only pushing for HOA reform because this happened to you personally. Why didn't you care about this issue before? That's a fair question. The truth is, I was aware of HOA overreach issues, but I hadn't prioritized them because I was focused on other matters like the drought, education funding, and infrastructure. What happened to me personally has made this issue impossible to ignore, and I'm not going to apologize for that. Sometimes it takes a dramatic event to spur action, and I'm committed to making sure something positive comes from this negative experience. The press conference lasted over an hour. By the time I wrapped it up, I was exhausted but satisfied. We'd controlled the narrative. I'd been transparent about my intentions, and the public response seemed positive based on the social media monitoring Jennifer was doing in real time. Over the next few days, the story continued to dominate headlines. The 4 HOA board members were formally charged with multiple felonies. Gerald Henderson, the attorney who'd advised them, was being investigated by the Colorado Bar Association for legal malpractice. The demolition had cost the HOA's insurance company millions, and they were threatening to cancel coverage for the entire Elk Mountain Estates community. Patricia Kendall's husband, I learned, was a prominent real estate developer in Aspen. He released a statement saying he had no knowledge of his wife's actions and was deeply disappointed in her judgment. Translation: he was throwing her under the bus to protect his own business interests. Sandra Morrison, the treasurer, tried to claim she'd objected to the demolition plan, but had been outvoted, though the board meeting minutes contradicted that claim. Robert Cunningham and James Fletcher both lawyered up immediately and refused to make any public statements. The homeowners of Elk Mountain Estates were in an uproar. Some supported the board's actions, saying rules were rules and I should have paid my fines. But the majority were horrified, both by the destruction of my property and by the realization that the same thing could happen to them. There was a petition circulating to recall the entire board and dissolve the HOA altogether. I met with my legal team to discuss the civil lawsuit. We were suing the 4 board members personally, the HOA as an entity, and Gerald Henderson for legal malpractice. The damages were estimated at $15 million when you factored in the property value, personal belongings, emotional distress, and punitive damages. "Governor, I want to be straight with you," my lead attorney, Richard Morrison, said. "You're almost certainly going to win this case. The evidence is overwhelming, but collecting on a judgment this size might be challenging. The HOA's insurance will cover some of it, but probably not all. The board members' personal assets might not be enough to satisfy the rest. I don't care about the money, Richard. I want them held accountable. I understand, but we need to be realistic about what outcomes we can achieve. If you're willing to settle for a lower amount, we could probably get this resolved quickly. No settlements. I want this to go to trial. I want every detail of what they did exposed in court. I want other HOAs to see what happens when you abuse your power," he nodded. "Then we'll take it to trial, but be prepared for this to be a long process. Could be a year or more before we see a courtroom." The criminal case moved faster. The district attorney in Pitkin County was aggressive in prosecuting the case, likely because of the high-profile nature and the clear evidence of wrongdoing. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Meanwhile, I was working with legislative leaders on the HOA reform bill. State Senator Linda Brennan, a Democrat from Boulder, and State Representative Tom Harrison, a Republican from Grand Junction, agreed to be the primary sponsors. It was a bipartisan effort, which was rare enough these days, but the HOA issue seemed to transcend party lines. Everyone had a horror story or knew someone who did. The bill we drafted was comprehensive. It required HOAs to provide written notice and a hearing before imposing any fine over $500. It prohibited HOAs from foreclosing on properties or taking destructive action without a court order. It mandated that all HOA board members carry liability insurance. It created a state ombudsman position to investigate HOA complaints. And it established criminal penalties for HOA board members who engaged in fraud, harassment, or abuse of power. The pushback was immediate and fierce. The Community Associations Institute, a national organization representing HOAs, called the bill government overreach and said it would destroy property values and undermine community standards. Real estate developers complained that it would make it harder to establish and maintain planned communities. Some conservative groups argued that it violated freedom of contract and property rights, but the public support was overwhelming. We received thousands of emails and calls supporting the legislation. Town halls were packed with people sharing their stories of HOA abuse. The media coverage was extensive and generally favorable. Even the editorial boards of major newspapers, which usually hated regulation, endorsed the bill as a necessary check on HOA power. 3 months after the demolition, the criminal trial began. I attended every day of proceedings, sitting in the front row of the courtroom to watch justice unfold. The prosecution's case was devastating. They presented the fraudulent permit application, showing how the HOA had lied about the structure being dangerous. They called the demolition company's owner, who testified that he never would have taken the job if he'd known the truth. They showed photographs of my home before the demolition, clearly demonstrating it was in excellent condition. The defense tried to argue that the HOA had acted in good faith based on their attorney's advice, but that argument fell apart when Gerald Henderson took the stand. Under cross-examination, he admitted he'd never researched the legal authority for the demolition, had never reviewed Colorado property law, and had simply assumed the HOA's CC and Articus gave them unlimited power to enforce their rules. Mr. Henderson, are you telling this court that you advised your clients they could demolish a $10 million home without even checking whether they had the legal authority to do so? The prosecutor asked. Henderson squirmed in his seat. I believe the CC and Articus were clear enough. You believed? Did you verify? I reviewed the CC and R documents, yes. Did you research Colorado statutes regarding property destruction? Did you consult any case law? Did you check with the county about proper procedures? No, but... So you gave your clients legal advice that resulted in the commission of multiple felonies without doing even basic due diligence. I didn't think it would be an issue. The jury looked disgusted. So did the judge, for that matter. Gerald Henderson's legal career was over, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Patricia Kendall's testimony was equally damning. Under questioning from her own attorney, she admitted that she'd known the demolition was aggressive and potentially problematic, but she'd been tired of residents thinking they could just ignore the rules. When asked if she'd considered less drastic measures, like a lawsuit to collect the fines, she said it would have taken too long and sent the wrong message to other residents. What message did you want to send, Miss Kendall? The prosecutor asked during cross-examination. That we take our community standards seriously. So you wanted to send a message by demolishing the governor's house. I didn't know he was the governor at the time. Does it matter? Would it have been acceptable to demolish someone else's house to send a message? She didn't have a good answer for that. None of them did. The defense was weak because there was no defense. They'd committed crimes, plain and simple, and now they were facing the consequences. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts for all 4 defendants. Patricia Kendall broke down crying when the verdict was read. Robert Cunningham sat stone-faced, staring at the table in front of him. Sandra Morrison looked angry, like she still couldn't believe this was happening to her. James Fletcher just looked defeated. Sentencing was scheduled for a month later. The prosecution was recommending prison time, arguing that the severity of the crime and the need for deterrence justified incarceration. The defense attorneys were pleading for probation and restitution, claiming their clients were otherwise law-abiding citizens who'd made a terrible mistake. While we waited for sentencing, the HOA reform bill was moving through the legislature. It passed the House with strong bipartisan support, 82-18. The Senate vote was scheduled for the following week, and we had the votes to pass it there too. Assuming it cleared the Senate, it would come to my desk for signature, and I'd already announced I would sign it immediately. The civil trial was still months away, but the criminal convictions had basically sealed that case too. My attorneys were now in discussions with the HOA's insurance company about a settlement. They were offering $12 million to avoid a trial. Richard thought we should take it, but I was still reluctant. I wanted my day in civil court too, wanted the full extent of the damages laid out in a public forum, but I was also exhausted. The past few months had been draining, both emotionally and mentally. I was the governor of Colorado, and I'd spent an enormous amount of time and energy dealing with this HOA situation, when I should have been focused on running the state. My approval ratings had actually increased because of the public's support for my stance, but I knew I needed to get back to the business of governing. "Richard, if we settle, do we get to dictate the terms?" I asked during one of our meetings. "To some extent, yes. What did you have in mind?" "I want a public apology from the HOA. I want them to admit wrongdoing and commit to policy changes. I want them to pay for a legal defense fund for homeowners in Colorado who are facing similar situations with their HOAs. And I want the full $12 million with no confidentiality clause. I want people to know exactly what this cost them. I can negotiate that. Let me reach out to their attorneys." The final settlement was reached 2 weeks later. The HOA and its insurance company agreed to pay $12 million in damages. Patricia Kendall, Robert Cunningham, Sandra Morrison, and James Fletcher each issued public apologies that were published in the Aspen Times and posted on the Elk Mountain Estates website. The HOA agreed to revise its CC and Articles to remove provisions that gave the board unchecked power. And $1 million of the settlement was designated for a legal defense fund administered by Colorado Legal Services to help homeowners fight HOA overreach. The sentencing hearing was emotionally charged. All 4 defendants made tearful statements expressing remorse. Their families pleaded for leniency. Character witnesses testified about their good works in the community, but the judge was unmoved by most of it. "What you did here was not a simple mistake in judgment," Judge Patricia Howard said from the bench. "You used your positions of authority to destroy someone's property. You lied to obtain the permits necessary to do so, and you showed a fundamental disregard for the rule of law. Mr. Whitmore happens to be the governor, but as he has repeatedly stated, that's not what makes this case significant. What makes it significant is that you believed you had the power to do this to anyone who crossed you." She sentenced Patricia Kendall to 2 years in prison, followed by 3 years of probation. Robert Cunningham got 18 months and 3 years probation. Sandra Morrison and James Fletcher each received 1 year and 3 years probation. All 4 were also ordered to pay restitution, though the criminal restitution was largely symbolic given the civil settlement. There were gasps in the courtroom when the sentences were announced. The defense attorneys immediately said they would appeal. The defendants were allowed to remain free on bond pending appeal, but the message was clear. The justice system was taking HOA abuse seriously. The day after sentencing, the Colorado Senate passed the HOA reform bill by a vote of 28-7. It came to my desk that afternoon, and I signed it in a public ceremony surrounded by homeowners who'd shared their stories of HOA abuse with me over the past few months. This legislation is not about destroying HOAs or preventing communities from maintaining standards, I said as I prepared to sign. It's about ensuring that HOAs operate within the law, that they treat homeowners fairly, and that they face consequences when they abuse their power. What happened to me should never happen to anyone, and with this bill, we're taking important steps to prevent it. I signed the Colorado Homeowner Protection Act with a flourish, and the room erupted in applause. Teresa, the woman whose mother had lost her home over a vegetable garden, was standing right behind me, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for caring." That might have been the most satisfying moment of my entire political career. Not passing a major budget, not delivering a successful state of the state address, but signing a bill that would protect ordinary people from the kind of abuse I'd experienced. The rebuild of my Aspen property took almost a year. I hired the same architect who designed the original house, but this time I made sure every single detail complied with the HOA's rules. Mountain Earth brown paint was replaced with autumn harvest brown. The outdoor lighting was dimmed to the exact approved lumens. Blue spruce trees were planted instead of aspens. The mailbox was shortened by 2 inches. The HOA never sent me another violation notice, which was probably wise on their part. By the time I moved back into the completed house, the appeals in the criminal case had been denied, and all 4 defendants had begun serving their sentences. Gerald Henderson had been disbarred and was facing his own legal troubles. The Elk Mountain Estates HOA had elected an entirely new board and was operating under revised CC and Articus that gave homeowners much more protection. I stood on the deck of my new house, looking out at the mountain views that had drawn me to this property in the first place. It was beautiful here, peaceful, exactly what I'd been looking for when I bought the land. But it was hard not to see the ghosts of what had happened, hard not to remember standing in a pile of rubble and realizing that an HOA had demolished my home over paint colors. My phone rang. It was Marcus calling from Denver with an update on some legislative issue that needed my attention. Back to the business of governing, back to the endless meetings and negotiations and compromises that defined political life. But I felt good about what we'd accomplished with the HOA reform. The law had already survived several legal challenges, and other states were looking at Colorado as a model for their own reform efforts. People still sent me stories almost daily. Homeowners who'd used the new law to fight back against abusive HOAs. Communities that had reformed their governance structures to be more fair and transparent. The Legal Defense Fund had helped dozens of families avoid foreclosure or fight unreasonable fines. Not everyone was happy with the changes. Some HOA purists argued that we'd gone too far, that property values would suffer, that communities would descend into chaos without strict enforcement. But the data didn't support those claims. Property values in Colorado communities with HOAs remained stable or increased. Communities didn't fall apart because people could plant tomatoes or use the wrong shade of paint. What did change was the culture. HOA boards became more cautious, more willing to work with residents, more aware that they could face real consequences for abuse of power. Homeowners felt more empowered to push back against unreasonable rules. The balance of power shifted in a healthier direction. Looking back on everything that had happened, I couldn't say I was glad my house had been demolished. It had been traumatic, expensive, and time-consuming to deal with. But I was glad something positive had come from it. Teresa's mother's story could have been mine, except I had the resources and position to fight back. How many other people had been victimized and had no recourse? How many had lost their homes or their savings to HOA abuse? The criminal trials had sent shockwaves through the HOA industry nationwide. Board members were more careful, more likely to consult actual legal experts before taking drastic action. Insurance companies were demanding better governance practices before issuing coverage. State legislatures across the country were introducing their own reform bills modeled on Colorado's law. Patricia Kendall was released from prison after serving 16 months of her 2-year sentence. I read about it in the Aspen Times. She gave a brief statement to the press saying she'd learned from her mistakes and hoped to rebuild her life. I didn't feel any satisfaction in her punishment. I'd never wanted revenge, just accountability and reform. She'd been held accountable, and the reform had happened. That was enough. The following year, I won re-election as governor in a landslide. The HOA issue hadn't been the main focus of the campaign, but it had certainly helped establish me as someone willing to take on powerful interests and fight for ordinary people. My opponent had tried to paint the whole thing as a personal vendetta, but the voters didn't buy it. They understood what had happened and appreciated that I'd turned it into something bigger than myself. During my second term, we strengthened the HOA reform law based on implementation experience. We increased funding for the state ombudsman position. We required more transparency in HOA finances and governance. We made it easier for homeowners to challenge unreasonable rules or fines. Each improvement made the system a little bit better, a little bit fairer. I never forgot standing in that pile of rubble, looking at what Patricia Kendall and her board had done, feeling that mixture of rage and disbelief. But I also never forgot Teresa crying tears of gratitude when I signed the reform bill, or the hundreds of emails from people telling me their HOA had backed down from an unreasonable demand because of the new law. 5 years after the demolition, I was invited to speak at a national conference on community association governance. It was a weird full-circle moment, standing in front of hundreds of HOA board members and managers, telling them the story of what had happened to me and why reform had been necessary. "I'm not here to demonize HOAs," I told the audience. "Most of you do important work maintaining property values and community standards. But what happened to me exposed a systemic problem: too much power with too little accountability. The reforms we implemented in Colorado haven't destroyed HOAs. They've made them better, more professional, more focused on genuine community service rather than petty enforcement." Some in the audience nodded in agreement. Others looked skeptical or hostile. But they all listened, because they knew my story wasn't unique. It was just the most dramatic version of something that happened every day across America. After my speech, a woman approached me. She was in her 70s, well-dressed with kind eyes. "Governor Whitmore, I wanted to thank you. I was on an HOA board in Florida for 15 years. I thought we were doing good work, maintaining standards, protecting property values. But after what happened to you, I started questioning some of our practices. We were fining people hundreds of dollars for the tiniest violations, threatening foreclosure, making residents miserable. I led an effort to reform our HOA from within, and now we focus on helping residents rather than punishing them. We still have standards, but we enforce them reasonably. And you know what? The community is happier, property values are higher, and no one lives in fear of their HOA anymore." That was the point. That was always the point. Not to destroy community associations, but to make them serve the communities they were supposed to represent. I eventually left the governor's office after completing 2 terms. I'd accomplished a lot during those 8 years, but the HOA reform remained one of the things I was most proud of. It wasn't the biggest policy achievement or the most politically significant, but it had tangibly improved people's lives in a way they could directly feel. My Aspen house became my permanent residence after I left politics. I'd grown to love the mountains, the quiet, the distance from the chaos of Denver and political life. Sometimes when I stood on my deck looking at the view, I thought about that day when Patricia Kendall stood among the rubble of my demolished home, so confident in her righteousness, so certain she had the power to do what she'd done. She'd been wrong, and the justice system had proven her wrong, and the legislature had reformed the laws to prevent anyone else from making the same mistake. That was how the system was supposed to work. Someone gets hurt, the wrong is exposed, accountability follows, reforms prevent future harm. It didn't always work that way. Often the powerful escaped consequences, the system failed, reforms never materialized. But this time, in this case, it had worked. Not perfectly, not quickly, and not without enormous effort and stress. But it had worked. I'd paid a price for that house to be demolished. Months of time, enormous emotional energy, and even though the settlement covered the financial losses, there were costs that couldn't be calculated in dollars. But the people who'd benefited from the reform that followed had made it worthwhile. The families who'd kept their homes, the residents who'd successfully challenged unreasonable fines, the communities that had reformed their governance to be more fair. Teresa's mother never got her house back. She died 2 years after losing it, heartbroken and displaced from the home she'd lived in for 4 decades. But Teresa told me that her mother had lived long enough to know about the reform law, to know that other families might be protected from what had happened to her. That had given her some peace in her final days. That was the weight of leadership I'd learned. You couldn't fix everything. You couldn't undo past harms, but you could try to prevent future ones, and sometimes that had to be enough. The Colorado Homeowner Protection Act was still in effect, still protecting people, still making a difference. Other states had passed similar laws. The national conversation about HOA reform had shifted. It wasn't a perfect solution, and there were still problems, but it was better than it had been. And my house, rebuilt from rubble, stood as a testament to both the abuse of power and the possibility of accountability. Every time I looked at it, I remembered both the destruction and the rebuilding, both the crime and the justice, both the anger and the reform that followed. Patricia Kendall had demolished my mountain mansion over unpaid fines. Too bad for her. I was the governor of the state, with the resources and platform to fight back and create lasting change. But the real lesson wasn't about my position or power. It was about the importance of checks and balances, accountability, and the rule of law. Those principles applied to governments, corporations, and yes, even homeowner associations. The mountain air was crisp and clean as I sat on my deck that evening, watching the sun set behind the peaks. Tomorrow, I'd get back to my new consulting work, advising other governors on policy reform. But tonight, I just sat and appreciated the view, the peace, and the knowledge that something good had come from something terrible. That was enough.